What is culture? What is culture defined by? Is it about race or ethnicity or region? Is it something that people can hold on to as a means to be exported to other cultures? Or is it something bound by tradition that we're able to pass on to younger generations? Can we covet such things as to keep them within the bounds of what the essence of said culture is supposed to be? There's a clip that I watched from a podcast featuring Dr. Umar Johnson and Mouse Jones that really got me thinking about the question. From Mouse's perspective, hip-hop has created jobs that otherwise wouldn't have existed. It's changed lives and brought opportunities to people that have gone on to form companies and have amassed generational wealth while driving fashion and what's considered quote-unquote cool. Now, Dr. Umar's, let's say, passionate response was that other than fashion, which I guess isn't something he puts very much stock into in the first place, hip-hop hasn't created anything of substance in our community except promoting drug dealers and gang violence as quote-unquote cool and fashionable. Now, while obviously I don't fully agree with Dr. Umar's take, honestly, I think he was being a bit disingenuous. It got me thinking, nonetheless, about Black culture as a whole and what part hip-hop plays in our culture, and also how it compares to other cultures and how they're exported, how we export ours, and how it defines us as well as how other people's culture defines them. Now, it's kind of a strange segue, but I want to go back to 1945. August 6th and 9th, the U.S. kind of crossed the threshold that we really can't come back from. We dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, and that would have an enormous impact on the Japanese culture going forward. And you kind of see it depicted in numerous works of art coming after that period, particularly in anime. For those who don't know, anime is huge in Japan. It's, how we consider cartoons and comics kind of for kids. Everyone in Japan kind of has their genre of anime for the most part in manga. From little kids to grown-ups to elderly people, everyone. And now, while a bombing might have taken away human life in Japan, it seems to have also invigorated it, as usually happens. And with the pop art becoming a platform for Japanese artists to deal with and understand their victimization and loss at the time. And I'm not sure who said it, but pain and suffering often breeds great art and creativity. And from this tragic event, we get themes portrayed throughout modern classics like Godzilla, Akira, Evangelion, Astro Boy, countless others. I bring all that up because to me it mirrors the plight of Black Americans in some ways. During the 1940s, Japanese Americans experienced harsh treatment, seeing many people round up in internment camps throughout the country, and fear-mongering and mistreatment really resonates with me, as a Black person and putting myself in the perspective of Black folks at the time. And if we go forward a bit to the 60s and the 70s, Black American culture coming out of what we can call neo-slavery, a period defined mostly characterizing this group of people, newly freed people, as violent, vagrant, vulgar, to the point where most people that were free went back to work on the plantations that they were freed from, only to be fired at will and later picked up under what was newly termed the vagrancy law. And at this time, the only roles in movies for Black people, especially Black men, were blaxploitation and snuff films that were mostly relegated to grindhouse theaters in the lower income segments of the country. Mostly these roles were pimps and hustlers, pushed the scary Black man narrative. At the time, you had a budding affinity with martial arts and Asian culture in general in the Black community. And the Black Panthers, amongst promoting, let's say, any means necessary forms of protection, this also included chapters around the country teaching self-defense and promoting martial arts. And to be honest, it wasn't until Bruce Lee came along and created roles for folks like Jim Kelly and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar of the world, that you get the Black man on screen with some substance and backstory to him. So how does all this relate to Dr. Umar's take and the nature of culture and how it defines us? The topic is very near and dear to my heart because for me personally, aside from finding out about Jay Dilla at the time, my biggest inspiration in hip hop was anime. It came when I saw an anime called Samurai Champloo. Changed my life. It was done by a man, Jun Seba, better known as Nujabes. He passed away shortly before I found out about the series in 2010. And the way that the studio blended the art style to resemble all the elements of hip hop culture, from one of the main the main characters, Mugen, utilizing a more breakdance based fighting style with head spin, kicks, and all that stuff, to literally a traveling rap group in the show. Seeing graffiti-esque writing and art style to the perfectly curated hip hop soundtrack of Nujabes, it was enthralling, man. It was crazy. I didn't know exactly what it was I was hearing, but I instantly knew that I wanted to make music that sounded like that. I think the idea that this thing that was created in this country from the suffering of black people and how it could affect someone in Japan and influence them in their art to then go on and affect a kid in Chicago all these years later is a very marvelous thing. For that matter, as black people, whether it's because of our religious background as a whole or something that just exists within us and entices us to allow others to participate in our culture to the betterment and or detriment of it, to be honest. And while I do on the whole think that it's benefited us, there are some, let's call them questionable examples where I feel like it's been taken a little bit too far. And if we're following the example of other cultures, perhaps it calls for us to gatekeep just a little bit more. So now we come to the proverbial elephant in the room as to what the definition of culture is and where the line between appreciation and exploitation is, and highlighting our propensity as a people to be so readily willing to embrace others that try to ingratiate themselves into our culture that we run out of invitations to the cookout. It isn't lost on me that not very many, if not most other cultures don't really operate or see it in the same way. I know there are a lot of black people who don't fully buy into the idea that hip hop culture and black culture are intrinsically one and the same. And though I'm not necessarily one of those people, I do understand. And I think the sentiment comes from the fact that we all think of hip hop, how it originally started, and the encompassing megalithic monstrosity it's become are vastly different things. I think most people have an issue with the less desirable aspects of hip hop being associated with us as a whole. But it seems that when other cultures exhibit those same attributes, they're lauded for it and oftentimes, again, invited to the cookout. Now, don't get me wrong. While there are a lot of Japanese and Asian people that grew up and spent a lot of time around black folks, the cultural exchange and subsequent lack thereof seems to only be a one-way street. While I see tons of examples of Asian people that were exposed to black culture get into hip hop, Asians with afros, Aquafina, wherever she's from, you don't see very many examples of the opposite, where you have droves of black people being accepted into Asian and more specifically Japanese culture and flocking in droves to look like and dress like them. And if we're being honest and talking about anime and Japanese culture as a whole, the representation of black people throughout its history has been, well, controversial at best, and at worst, highly offensive. You got examples like Mr. Popo in Dragon Ball, Sister Chrome, Promised Neverland, and more recently you got Super Alloy, Dark Shine, and One Punch Man. And it just seems like our portrayal in their media is always one of exaggerated features, oversized lips, focused on damaging tropes and stereotypes, to the point where in the latest Assassin's Creed game, it features two protagonists, and you have a black man in more of a lead character role and not an overtly stereotypical character. And it sparks a bit of an international conversation as to what is cultural appropriation and what is appreciation, and where the line exists between the two. In a recent statement by the CEO of Crunchyroll, Rahul Purini, Crunchyroll being the biggest distributor of anime at the current time, I guess think of them like the Netflix of anime, said, and I quote, that anime must be inherently Japanese and told from the perspective of Japanese creators. We want more anime, more diverse stories, but it's important that Japanese creators continue to be involved in them, end quote. Now, I find this statement to be very interesting, and to be honest, I don't really know how to feel about it. I guess it begs a much bigger question. What is anime? What is culture? Once again, is it allowed for public consumption? Are you still allowed to gatekeep it once it's out in the public sphere? And should we, as black people, be treating hip hop the same way? Now, on one hand, I do understand and think that most of us here in the West also understand and differentiate Western creations of animations with those created in Japan. But that also got me thinking, because again, is it just defined as what is something that was created in Japan? Even though at the time I don't think it was necessary to question whether shows like The Boondocks or Legend of Korra were technically deemed anime. I think we've become a little bit too meta, to be honest, and get bogged down with the virtue signaling with things like that. But I think most of us who enjoyed the programs when they came out, and in a way, I think paid homage to the traditional anime and didn't necessarily need to call them as such. We didn't necessarily need to differentiate the two. Again, by and large, the cultural exchange seems to have been mutual, at least for the most part, except for the obvious racism at times. But if there seems to be this need to make a distinction of what is considered anime and what isn't, and if said distinction is purely based on whether or not that art was created in Japan or by Japanese artists, then I think it becomes a little bit dicey when trying to say what is appropriation and when clearly there are numerous instances of Asians borrowing, if not co-opting, black culture as well. So the question still remains, has hip-hop been a net positive or negative in our community? I think the answer is nuanced, in that we have not as a people embraced hip-hop as our culture, as Japanese people did with anime and manga. Both came from a place of pain and suffering and was a form of expression as such, but the embracing of the two just doesn't seem to line up, I guess. And for some reason, as black people, we seem to not want to tie ourselves down with any one particular concept that could unify us in that way. Now, while other cultures cultivate their unique art and are able to have ownership of it and control over it and how it's portrayed and distributed, we just have not fully embraced it as a people in that way. I think Dr. Umar has some good points, like how there isn't an institution behind hip hop that creates opportunities and general positivity in our community, and the violent misogynistic tropes that still pervade the genre definitely don't do us any favors. I would agree that there aren't very many forms of media that don't promote those same things though. And to be honest, the image of the vagrant, violent black person that you see in media was one that was cast upon us long before hip hop. All cultures have their forms of violent crime, whether it's the Italian mob, the Japanese Yakuza, South American MS-13, you name it, Russian mob. The only difference I can surmise is that it just hits different when it's black people.